The day jets entered the sky, air combat stopped being fair. One moment, propeller fighters ruled the air, twisting and turning in brutal dogfights where skill meant everything. The next moment, pilots were dying without ever seeing who killed them. Imagine climbing through cold blue sky in a World War II. Aeroprop fighter, engine roaring, hands tight on the stick, then a silver blur slices past at impossible speed. No warning, no dogfight, just a flash and a funeral notice. That blur was a jet, and it rewrote the rules in real time. Prop pilots were trained to hunt. Jets turned them into prey. These weren't experimental test flights or clean handovers of technology. This was a violent transition, fought in real wars by real men who had no choice but to adapt or die. Veterans who survived flak, Messerschmitts, and Zeros suddenly found themselves outpaced, outclimbed, and outgunned by machines that didn't even belong to their generation. The sky became a slaughterhouse of speed, where experience meant less than velocity and tradition got pilots killed. This was the most ruthless era in air combat history, the moment when propellers fought jets, and the future showed up looking for blood. When World War II ended, the world thought air combat had reached its final form. Propeller fighters had carried nations to victory, and the pilots who flew them were treated like untouchable legends. Aircraft like the P-51 Mustang, the Spitfire, the FW-190, and the Zero weren't just machines. They were proven killers, refined through years of brutal trial by fire. But while victory parades rolled through city streets, a quieter revolution was already warming up on the runways. Jet engines, once risky science projects, were suddenly real, and they didn't care about tradition. Air forces rushed to adopt them, not fully understanding what they were unleashing. Behind the scenes, Soviet pilots, some of the best in the world, were quietly flying MiGs, ordered to keep their mouths shut, avoid the coast, and never get captured alive. If one went down, it wasn't just a loss. It was an international incident waiting to explode. And so MiG Alley was born, a narrow strip of sky along the Yalu River where politics stopped and survival took over. Every mission launched with fake call signs, painted over markings, and rules that made zero sense once the shooting started. This wasn't just a battlefield. It was a Cold War chessboard at Mach speed, and both sides were about to learn just how unforgiving jet combat could be. As weeks turned into months, MiG Alley became a brutal classroom where every sortie taught lessons written in smoke and wreckage. Pilots on both sides started to understand that jet combat wasn't about tight turns and flashy moves anymore. It was about energy, altitude, and who controlled the fight before the first shot was even fired. The MiG-15 could climb like a rocket and hit hard, giving it the high ground advantage. Soviet-trained pilots used boom and zoom tactics, diving out of the sun, firing once, then rocketing back to safety before the Sabres could respond. Miss that first pass, and you were dead weight. The F-86 pilots adapted fast. They learned to fight smart, not proud. Instead of chasing MiGs straight up and burning fuel like idiots, Sabre pilots stayed fast, stayed low when needed, and relied on superior roll rate and deadly accuracy. The radar gun sight turned deflection shooting into a science, letting American pilots land hits that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. Suddenly, dogfights became violent, split-second math problems, angles, speed, gravity, solved at 6 miles a minute. Kill boards started filling up. Aces were being born in jets for the first time in history. Names like Gabreski, Jabara, and Davis began circulating through ready rooms like legends in the making. But victory came with a price. Every engagement pushed aircraft and pilots to their limits. G-forces blacked out vision. Engines flamed out. One mistake, one bad pull, and you didn't just crash, you disintegrated. MiG Alley wasn't just producing winners. It was grinding pilots down, forcing both sides to evolve or get erased from the sky. And the real storm was still building. By late 1951, MiG Alley wasn't just a combat zone. It was a rivalry soaked in ego, fear, and unfinished business. Every patrol felt personal now. Pilots weren't just flying missions. They were hunting ghosts from previous fights, replaying near-death moments in their heads while strapping back into the cockpit. The sky had a memory, and it remembered every mistake. Encounters grew more aggressive, more calculated. Sabres began pushing deeper, daring MiGs to cross invisible lines, while MiG pilots climbed higher and waited longer, turning patience into a weapon. Command pressure kept rising. American leaders needed air superiority to protect bombers and prove jet dominance to the world. Soviet commanders needed results without exposure, wins without fingerprints. That meant stricter rules, faster turnarounds, and pilots sent back into combat even when they were mentally cooked. Fatigue became the silent killer. Reaction time slowed. Situational awareness cracked. And in jet combat, a half-second delay was a death sentence. The fights themselves grew savage. Head-on passes at closing speeds over 1,000 miles per hour. Cannon shells flashing past canopies like tracer lightning. Sabres shuddering as MiG rounds punched holes clean through wings and fuselages. There were no clean victories anymore. Even the winners limped home, fuel gauges screaming empty, hands shaking from adrenaline. Losses stacked up on both sides, but nobody backed off. MiG Alley had become a proving ground for national pride and future doctrine. Every kill was studied, every loss dissected. Tactics evolved weekly, sometimes daily. What worked yesterday could get you killed tomorrow. And as the conflict intensified, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about Korea anymore. The world was watching, and the next mistake could drag the Cold War straight into open flames. By 1952, the strain was crushing everyone involved. Pilots on both sides were flying multiple sorties a day, living on bad coffee, adrenaline, and the constant knowledge that tomorrow's mission might be their last. The thrill was gone. What remained was pressure, from commanders demanding results, from squadron mates counting empty bunks, and from the cold realization that survival often came down to luck. In MiG Alley, experience didn't guarantee safety anymore. Sometimes it just meant you'd lived long enough to get careless. Sabre pilots began noticing it first. The radio chatter sounded different, shorter, sharper, tense. Formation discipline slipped. Pilots fixated on targets too long, ignoring their six. MiG pilots felt it too, trapped by strict orders and political paranoia. Bail out over the wrong side of the river, and you weren't a hero, you were a liability. Some Soviet pilots reportedly carried pistols with a single round, just in case capture became unavoidable. That kind of pressure eats at the soul. Aircraft failures increased. Engines flamed out at altitude. Guns jammed mid-fight. Oxygen systems malfunctioned, leaving pilots dizzy and half-conscious while pulling brutal GS. One malfunction in a jet fight didn't mean retreat, it meant death. And yet missions kept launching. Losses were quietly reassigned, chalked up as missing, buried in classified reports that wouldn't see daylight for decades. The breakdown wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a hesitation before pulling the trigger. Sometimes it was a Sabre diving alone after a MiG that didn't exist. Other times, it was a veteran ace deciding he'd had enough, requesting reassignment before the sky finally claimed him. MiG Alley was no longer forging heroes. It was testing how much a human mind could take before it cracked. The biggest shock of MiG Alley didn't come from the sky. It came from the truth buried beneath it. For years, the world believed these jet duels were American pilots versus North Korean rookies or Chinese trainees still learning the ropes. That story fell apart fast once wreckage, radio intercepts, and post-war intelligence reports started lining up. The pilots flying those MiGs weren't amateurs. They were elite Soviet airmen, many of them World War II veterans with dozens of kills already under their belts. And suddenly, the scoreboard made a lot more sense. This revelation flipped the narrative on its head. The Korean War air battles weren't just a regional conflict. They were a secret, high-speed showdown between the world's two emerging superpowers. Every dogfight risked more than a pilot's life. It risked global escalation. That's why MiGs avoided the coastline. That's why Russian wasn't spoken on open radio. That's why downed pilots disappeared into silence. Both sides were lying, on purpose, to keep the Cold War cold. Even more wild, the kill ratios everyone bragged about didn't tell the full story. Claims were inflated. Losses were buried. Some pilots on both sides swore they shot down enemies that records say flew home. In the chaos of jet combat, truth moved slower than propaganda. The real outcome wasn't who scored more kills. It was what both sides learned. Energy fighting. High-altitude interception. Jet versus jet doctrine was being written in real time. paid for in blood and secrecy. MiG Alley wasn't just about who won dogfights. It was about what the world wasn't allowed to know. And once that curtain started slipping, the entire conflict took on a darker, far more dangerous meaning. As the truth quietly spread through intelligence channels and pilot whispers, the tone in MiG Alley shifted from competition to obsession. This was no longer just about defending bombers or holding airspace. It became personal. Sabre pilots knew now they weren't facing rookies. They were up against hardened Soviet aces who had survived the meat grinder of World War II. Every loss felt heavier. Every victory felt unfinished. Call signs became infamous. Certain MiG formations were recognized instantly, and when they appeared on radar, Sabre squadrons leaned forward in their seats. This was unfinished business at 40,000 feet. On the other side, Soviet pilots felt the same fire. They were ordered to fly, fight, and vanish without credit, without medals they could wear, without public acknowledgement. Meanwhile, American aces were becoming headlines back home. That imbalance bred anger. Soviet pilots began targeting specific Sabre units, memorizing tactics, anticipating reactions, setting traps instead of reacting to fights. The goal wasn't just survival, it was payback. Both sides refined ambush strategies. MiGs climbed higher than ever, waiting silently in thin air until Sabres committed to a chase. Sabres countered by flying in layered formations, baiting MiGs into turning fights where American roll rates could dominate. Every encounter felt like a rematch, even if the pilots had never met. The sky became a personal ledger, deaths marked in contrails and cannon fire. By now, everyone understood one thing. The next major engagement wouldn't be random. It would be deliberate, planned, a test of everything learned so far. And when it happened, it wouldn't just settle scores. It would decide whose vision of air combat would rule the future. The clash came without warning, but not without intent. One cold morning over MiG Alley, radar screens lit up like a Christmas tree. Multiple MiG formations climbing hard, Sabres already airborne to intercept. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a full-blown jet brawl at the edge of the stratosphere. Contrails crisscrossed the sky as fighters punched through thin air, engines screaming, pilots locked into pure instinct. There was no room for hesitation. Whoever seized the first advantage would own the fight. MiGs struck from above, diving in tight formations, cannons barking in brutal, half-second bursts. Sabres scattered, rolled, and countered, snapping into vertical turns that ripped G-forces through their bodies. Pilots blacked out and woke up still pulling. Missiles didn't exist yet. This was knife fighting at Mach speed. One Sabre disintegrated mid-roll, another MiG spiraled down trailing flame, its pilot ejecting into enemy territory with no guarantee of survival. Radios exploded with shouted warnings and broken call signs. Wingmen saved each other by inches. Some didn't make it. Fuel gauges dropped fast as pilots stayed in the fight far longer than doctrine allowed. Nobody wanted to be the first to disengage. Pride, fear, and revenge kept them locked together in a spinning, violent ballet above the clouds. When it finally ended, the sky felt eerily quiet. Survivors limped home with empty guns and damaged jets, unsure who had actually won. Claims would be made. Reports would be rewritten. But everyone who flew that day knew the truth. Jet combat had crossed a line. This wasn't experimentation anymore. This was modern air war in its rawest form, and there was no going back. When the guns finally went quiet over Korea, MiG Alley didn't leave behind a clear winner. It left behind a warning. The pilots who survived carried scars no victory parade could erase. Some returned home as heroes, others as ghosts bound by secrecy, unable to speak about battles that had nearly killed them. The jets themselves told the real story. Every modern fighter that followed, from the Phantom to the Eagle to the stealth machines of today, carries DNA forged in those brutal duels over the Yalu River. Energy fighting, radar-assisted targeting, high-altitude dominance. None of it came from theory alone. It was paid for in lives. MiG Alley proved that air superiority isn't guaranteed by technology alone. It belongs to the pilots who adapt faster, think clearer under pressure, and understand that ego gets you killed. It also proved something darker. Wars don't need declarations to escalate. The world's first jet versus jet war happened in the shadows, with superpowers lying straight-faced to avoid Armageddon. That lesson still matters. And here's the real moral. Progress in warfare doesn't slow down. It accelerates. Every conflict pushes the next one closer, faster, deadlier. The men who fought in MiG Alley weren't chasing history. They were trapped inside it, unknowingly shaping the future of combat with every trigger pull. If this story opened your eyes to how modern aerial warfare was truly born, don't let it end here. Subscribe, like, comment, and share to keep real history alive. This is Xtreme USA, where the sky never forgets, and neither should we.